The United States, and the world for that matter, have a long history of racism and white supremacy. When we think of white supremacy, we usually think of images like these: slavery, the KKK, and Nazis. What we don't immediately imagine is the subtle ideologies held up by continued complacency with white supremacy in this country, heavily affecting institutions like healthcare. But before we get into that, let's first talk a little bit about the history of how it came to be in the US. Our nation was founded on white power. Christopher Columbus came to this country and stole the land from Native Americans, leading to the eventual slaughter of millions, and white Europeans forcing them from their land. Over the years, European settlers brought in millions of African slaves to work on farms. Following the Civil War, slavery was abolished, but this did not stop white supremacy and racism in America. Following the abolition of slavery, white supremacist groups arose in America, the most famous being the Ku Klux Klan, who restored white supremacy in the South and destroyed the Reconstruction era. Segregation and Jim Crow laws were illegal thereafter until the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This made segregation illegal, but the fight against white supremacy still continued, which brings us to today. White supremacy is still very alive, just not in the way we are used to seeing it. We are rightfully quick to condemn the KKK and the Charlottesville alt-right marchers, mostly because of their extreme nature. And while this is a huge step from a few decades ago, white supremacy is still prevalent, just in a different form. In a paper he wrote, Francis Lee Ansley explains, "By white supremacy, I do not mean to allude only to the self-conscious racism of white supremacist hate groups. I refer instead to a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources, and conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority." White supremacy is harder to spot these days because it has masked itself as something so innate in our culture that it has become unrecognizable in the form of white privilege. White privilege is not the assumption that white people don't struggle or don't work hard for what they earn, but rather recognizing that white people have a built-in advantage in our society. Francis E. Kendall describes it as having greater access to power and resources than people of color in the same situation do. So you may be wondering now, how does all of this connect to occupational therapy? Well, it's really all about the social and economic disadvantages and how we can help. According to studies, there is ample evidence that suggests there is a disparity in the quality of healthcare that is delivered to white people versus minorities. This disparity exists at the level of the healthcare system, and discrimination occurs at the personal, institutional, and societal levels. Studies have shown that disparities in health are mostly due to socioeconomic policies and lack of health education. In America, poverty among minority populations is much higher than that among white Americans, ultimately affecting access to affordable health care and health education. Minorities are also at a much higher risk than their white counterparts for developing chronic diseases such as heart disease and cancer, and are also more likely to be discriminated against and stereotyped in the healthcare setting. These large disparities in the healthcare system cannot be ignored. Occupational therapists have always been very conscious about occupational and social injustices. In the Willard and Spackman book, Townsend and Wilcock write, "It is an occupational therapist's responsibility to advance understanding of occupational injustices, to educate others, and to effect change. It is not only our responsibility as practitioners to recognize the injustices and disparities in the healthcare system, but also to act as educators to spread this information. To eliminate racial disparities in healthcare, it will take a widespread effort to change policies at the governmental level. But until then, efforts to combat racial inequality and white privilege will remain as important in healthcare as anywhere else in the U.S., and occupational therapists, like many times before, will be at the forefront of the battle."